Hi, my name is Ken Asselson. I wrote the Microbiome Prescription website, and today I want to talk about what I view and why I view the best diet option for you to work from in terms of a basic one. For variations such as DNA defects and medical conditions may cause it to be altered, but I'm talking about an abstract best diet. The basis of selecting it is very simple. The microbiome and the DNA evolves together. And as diets in an area change, so does the microbiome. Now, in the last 200 years, there have been an outrageous amount of change of diet. Generation to generations are eating different things, which means the microbiome becomes suddenly unstable or is busy adapting. Some people will do it with no problem. They're absolutely fine eating even today's junk food. Other people, misery. They end up with mountains of health issues, especially autoimmune. So to step back and say, okay, we want what is the best base diet to be working from for your health. You want one which your microbiome has evolved through generations and generations, for hundreds of years or even thousands of years to be the best. So the idea is what we want to do is give it what we want to move back to the last long period of stable diet, because that is likely the best diet to resync your microbiome into a healthy one. That doesn't mean going back to your father's or your grandfather's one, because their diets between you, your parents, your grandparents, even your great-grandparents is different every single time, which means that you don't have long-term stability in terms of microbiome evolution. So we could go back. Now, for I myself, I am a Danish extraction. But let's take it one step further. I want to make sure that I am a Danish extraction, or at least Northern European extraction, that somewhere along the way I don't have a bunch of Italian DNA in me or some Spanish DNA or other types of DNA from all over the world. So what I have done is I use my 23andMe sample, and I suggest always getting a sample from some sort of DNA analysis, because it can be very helpful in identifying genetic defects you have or the genetic issues. Like, for example, typical one is methylation issue. So I went over there, and here's my example. And as you can see, guess where I am? I'm all over Northern Europe. In fact, most of them up there. And if I click on anyone, oh, here I am. I'm close to a particular upgrade, which is 50 AD. Here is, wait a minute, that means I have been, my ancestors, or a large percentage of my ancestors have been eating Northern European diets for 4,000 years. Forget people saying you need to eat like the Egyptians. Excuse me, I have no Egyptians in me for 4,000 years. None whatsoever. If there was Egyptian in me, hey, I'll have dots down here. I don't. It's all Northern European. So 4,000 years here. Another one, 650. So contemporary, 1600, contemporary. 1000 AD, Viking, which is what I expected, 250. Number one, not as strong, and that's 4,000 years ago. Number one, never a 4,000-year-old one. Oh boy, do I have a ton of 4,000-year-old samples, all from Northern European history. And that means diet in this era is probably what is best, as well as, of course, a few from Iceland. Iceland only going to go back 1,000 years, because that's when the first people came to Iceland. So we now have established for me where the DNA, and thereby where the diet, my ancestors for the last 4,000 years come from. A food common down in south of Europe would be a unnatural food for my microbiome. It may tolerate it, but it's not natural. It is not what it would have been doing. So that is the basis of the base suggestion, which is to work from whatever. Now, in terms of evidence, we do find that a environmental change, as in a diet or other forms of change, can be passed down for 14 generations. That's 500 years. In other words, what my ancestors ate in 1500 may still be impacting my microbiome today. Fortunately, from 1500 back to probably 500, the diet was pretty stable in that period. So, okay, I have a stable microbiome from that period of time, which is likely going to be the microbiome my stomach, my gut will likely attempt to quote roots to, because it's the greatest influence. We're seeing also continuations. Another example where the grandkids are influenced by the grandparents' diet. So we're talking about 2 generations, and just again, both of them well documented. So what we also find is that diet and epigenetic change can actually change the DNA sequence. So the evolution is more than just evolution. DNA is not as stable as we often believe it. It will be modified. Epigenetics is a key word which talks about the activation of parts of DNA for a particular environment. For example, stress would cause activation of certain parts of the DNA. But what we're talking about is stress or other things such as diet change actually changing the DNA sequence. So, first thing is, okay, try to avoid introducing atypical foods for your microbiome. Okay, well, I have one in front of me called coffee. It was introduced about 500 years ago. It's one which I'll tolerate, whatever. But other examples of recently introduced foods which are more likely a greater impact than coffee are potatoes and bananas. And bananas particularly because they've been reduced to a single species of banana. Forget about genetic variations. It's all Cavendish, and that particular species has been further bred for good shelf life, easy to transport, blah, blah, blah. All of the commercial interests, not the microbiome or health interest. It is for the commercial profitability that they have been modified. Same thing happens with wheat. Wheat has been basically genetically bred to be able to grow in latitudes further north, better, more gluten coming out of it, etc. So the newer fruits often are very different than older fruits, even though they may have the same name. Let's take a look at a few things. Meat consumption. From 1960 to 2000, this is just 50 years. I was born before 1961. So what we see a 30% increase in the consumption of meat in the U.S. Other countries like Brazil, oh boy, we're talking about 4 times as much meat. So if you are of Spanish extraction from part of South America, watch out for that massive increase of meat consumption. It is not natural. It is unnatural for your microbiome. I'll keep using the word unnatural. Similar for Chinese. Oh joy. If you're Chinese extraction, please suggest you do a major trimming back of all meat consumption. It's just because, again, I keep using the word unnatural because that is what actually is appropriate use of it. Now, let's go on and let's look at meat consumption a little bit further back. And what we see how meat consumption has changed in the U.S. for the last 110 years. And we see that beef has climbed from 150 to over 250, almost double. So twice as much beef is being consumed. But what is really interesting is chicken has massively grown in terms of amount. Chicken often is labeled as a healthy meat. So I went and, in my usual manner, I went and checked to see if there's evidence for studies supporting, quote, common mythology, folk legend, or internet fact, as I sometimes refer to it. And basically, we find two things. First of all, Western diet and the changes has caused a massive number of likely changes, including neurological issues, ADHD, autism, as well as autoimmune conditions. We also have sugar consumption, which, excuse me, do you want to talk about a massive increase? And here's the problem. Trying to get sugar out of your diet is going to be a challenge. Why? Because most commercially prepared food are laced with sugar. The manufacturers are almost like drug addicts or drug pushers. They want people to become more addicted to their food, and sugar in their food helps with the food, quote, tasting better, mainly because you have gotten the person addicted to sugar in the food, and thereby more sales. Okay, now another example is looking at legumes, and in just the last 3 years went from 12 to 8.3. In other words, almost a 1/3 drop. Dry beans, similarly, almost a 1/3 drop in just a few years, and it's probably getting worse. Legumes and beans should be a high part of your diet because those are traditional. Think, if you're Northern European, think of it especially about what type of food is going to survive the winter. Legumes and beans and dry beans are going to survive the winter very nicely. So guess what? Your ancestors are going to eat tons of it. So one of my daughters basically has taken the same attitude I do, even though I never indoctrinated her, or she developed it independently. Basically, she sees the same thing happening. When immigrants come to Canada, same thing applies to the U.S., and adapt a Western or standard American diet, a STAD diet, basically health issues explode, obesity explode, etc. And the logic is very simple. The microbiome isn't suited for that. So, you're just creating problems because you are shifting from your natural food to a bunch of unnatural foods and suffering the side effects. And as I indicate by label here, keeping up with the Joneses, health issues. By trying to imitate the Joneses down the street, to use that old expression, you are actually keeping up with their health issues. I, in some cases, making them worse for yourself than they suffer. And we have a ton of things from Latinos to Indians to Chinese. All of them, the same pattern is there. You leave your historically natural food consumption and you go into an unnatural standard American diet, and your health goes down. And now notice the word is standard American, not standard English or Scottish or Irish, standard American, which has been spread more and more worldwide to all developing countries as part of entrepreneur empire building. Get everybody addicted to the same food. So a couple of studies dealing with the impact. For example, 10 grams of sugar more per day results in higher Alzheimer's risk. And then we do have an Alzheimer and a dementia explosion in the Western world. So finding your own historical diet means you having to do research. For myself, I am of Danish extraction, and I've done the research in the past. There was one lovely book I called Danish Cookbooks, which basically goes through all the Danish cookbooks for the last 500 to 600 years and identify things going through. For example, the first thing you do is I look at all those spices. Tons and tons and tons of spices are used in everyday food. Far more than we are doing nowadays. Most of the time, the spices are used for special meals. They weren't. So we have become unnatural for the use of spices. We have dropped them down, like we have dropped down the consumption of legumes and dry beans. White bread, which is wheat bread, is very uncommon, expensive, and only seen in the upper class home on special occasion. It is show-off food. Show-off food, saying I can afford white bread, white wheat bread, I can afford it. And guess what? We have major health issues from consumption of white bread. It may have been prestigious, but it's not healthy. And most of the carbohydrates for my ancestors came from rye bread, not rye wheat mixture, 100% rye bread. And I still can get that. There are companies in Germany who package very nice rye bread, 100% rye, which I pick up on Amazon, and I just have that on my shelf and use it nicely shrink wrapped so nothing goes bad until you need it. Now, I should point out that some readers favor a diet that may be a vegan or vegetarian. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. If you're born in India, definitely that's the way to go. Again, it's where your ancestors are. So back to my ancestry map. If my dots were over in India, going vegetarian is probably an absolutely good choice. It is not for Scandinavian. It is a totally different experience. Okay, and what do we have here? We have a list of things: cauliflower, artichokes, rutabaga, turnips, beets, beetroot, particularly beetroot being used for digestion and blood issues, which is something which we don't use beetroot that often nowadays. And that may be part of our problems with digestion. No potatoes. Very simple, because guess what? They were expensive in the medieval period, and things changed. One key thing is technological improvements which the cost for rare foods becoming common. Sugar is an example. Wheat is another example. And what we have here is Viking Farm cold hardy vegetables. Cold. I wonder why they want cold hardy. Cough, cough, cough. So we have a nice list of things. They're fond of apples and cherries from wild or cultivated trees, and clackerberries when they were keyword in season. Seasonality is an important aspect because the microbiome adapts to the fact that there are seasonality. So having fresh apples in January, or fresh pears, or a fruit which is out of season for the local environment, is probably going to do your microbiome more harm than good, because it's just, again, keyword, unnatural. Okay, now, I had a bit of fun with this one. Frimurti for breakfast describes a 14th century manuscript, the form of curry, which means cooking, and has some excellent recipe. And one of them is Frimurti with porpé, better than having porpoise with porridge. Okay, stop and think about it. That is so atypical for a modern diet. And I just mentioned that, hey, if you can't get porpoise, use ugunuk, bearded seal. It is a good substitute for it. And it has a very unique taste. My wife knows well, because she had some up when she was living in the coastal area of Alaska for a year with her parents. So maybe a bit of a challenge getting the bearded seal, fermented bearded seal, but if you're challenging, but it's just again showing how our diets have changed a lot in 500 years. One of the things to keep in mind is surviving recipe books are generally written for the upper class. Who could afford books? Upper class, not the peasant. So be careful with them. Treat them with a little bit of caution. They're not typical eating, they are atypical eating, but you may get some useful information from there. There are also problems with adaptation of old recipe. And some of the problems are that the actual, what we call a particular food, has changed significantly. The difference of taste between a wild mountain blueberry and a cultivated on a farm blueberry is night and day. I know that well from hiking in the mountains. So, but we do have a whole bunch of collection of cookbooks available for you to start exploring. Again, this is European or origin. I'm sure there are other cookbooks, other parts of the world. It's just a matter of digging down. Here is example of a crepe or omelet. Tansy, which I'll leave you to look up. Rue leaf, another interesting one, which you don't usually use in cooking. Wild celery, mint, sage, etc. Parsley, violet leaves, spinach, green chard, all of them going into an omelet. Okay, that is not your usual omelet. Nowadays, omelets tend to often be, how to say, devoid of enhancements, as in eggs, milk, a crust, you cook it, etc. Guess what? You're giving up all the polyphenols that comes from other things. You forget all the other complex chemicals that are in those foods. You are doing without them. You're starving your body of things which it has naturally expect to have there, because that's what historically has been there. Now, one of the other aspects is often even how you live and how much exposure do you have to the outside natural world. Lovely case of Hutterites and Amish. Both of them are the same genetic pool, which really does it. They eat similar, but their farming practices has a tremendous impact on how they do it. One actually lives further away from their farms and animals. They more or less are a living example of the hygiene hypothesis. That is part of the problems we're having, is we become too hygienic. The reason we became hygienic is to stop certain types of infections coming in, but we have gone overboard too far, and the result of which we are missing the challenges which the body has naturally evolved to expect to be there. And since it doesn't get what it's accustomed to getting, it suddenly becomes asthma and allergies and other things. Okay, so I don't advocate a paleo diet, but a regional medieval diet modified for any modern nutritional needs are there, including medical needs. Avoid prepared foods to be from scratch, ideally organic from heritage seeds. One of my lovely things is orange carrots are unnatural. Carrots are not naturally orange. They were bred to be orange because of marketing concerns. Historically, carrots have been white. Seasonality, do. Now, if you're Heinz 57, etc., get your DNA done, go over to 23andMe and try figuring out where most of your ancestors are coming from, and hence the diets in those regions. Nice and simple. So, one thing I wanted to emphasize is often studies on just as a healthy diet is a comparison to a SAD diet, a standard American diet. It's not, if you go gluten-free versus paleo versus Atkinson's, all of them, you'll find studies saying they are healthier for you. They don't compare to each other. And I give a nice simple example. Bananas are healthy, nutritious, good, reliable source from Healthline. And then you hear the keywords, compare with other high carbohydrate food. If you compare to non-high high carbohydrate foods, the answer changes. So be careful about falling into, you are eating healthy as in you're not eating standard American diet. Doesn't mean you actually are eating healthy. What it all means is you doing one step away from standard American diet. Try moving it further away. Try moving back. I hate to say it. The diet of your ancestors may be your greatest inheritance. One other factor I thought I'll toss out is the blood type diet. There's evidence for it. In fact, being a reality, or should say, there's evidence that blood type is associated with certain types of medical conditions and issues. Those same medical conditions and issues are associated with the microbiome. Hence, one could infer the blood type and the microbiome connected, and there are people such as Peter the animal, who had written books on the subject, etc. And what I did, rather than going in and going off in the air, which I don't have expertise, I have tossed Peter a request for him to do a blog post on it. But I basically went and looked at blood type, and from the point of view of evolution, if people in a region eat a specific type of diet and blood type is a factor, then people who that local diet does not do well with should be underrepresented, and people who do very well with their local diet should be overrepresented in terms of blood type. And what we see here is some circumstantial evidence. Here we have Scandinavian one, and then we have India. And if you take a look at it, O positive, we have low number except for Iceland. Iceland is different than these because Iceland is generally fish products is their main source of meat. So they are atypical for Scandinavia. But if you take a look at that, you go and you see that we have some significant changes. For example, O negative does much better in a Nordic country than in the Indian country. These countries, you tend to be vegetarian. These, you tend to be meat eaters. And here's another one. Meat eaters, vegetarian, they just don't do well. And so you can go through and take a look at there, for example, meat eaters and vegetarian. Again, there, when you hit the United States, we have a hodgepodge people, so things are not as clean. United Kingdom has a large amount of immigration. If you go over to Ireland, what we find is that Ireland and Iceland are very typically similar, and that probably may come from the fact that both had a large Viking settlement happening about 1200 years ago, and actually the diet is very similar between those two countries. So bottom line, food is acquired taste. You may have to unacquire your sad diet. Cut sugar and salt from the diet can be hard for many people. Eating turnips and rhubarb may be a very unfamiliar taste. Your kids may first say, yuck, that's horrible, give me a pizza instead. You may have to educate and persevere. Eating 100% rye bread with goat cheese is definitely an acquired taste. Having fermented herring on rye bread is even more extreme. And if you're Swedish, you know what I mean. If you're not, you don't want to know. Daughter points out to me a reason old recipe don't always work is because ingredients either no longer are available or they've to change over the years, or the techniques of preparing food has changed, the temperature being used, how long it's cooked, etc. So that is basically my logic, and that is a walkthrough of it. If you go and somebody says, well, we should be eating how the Egyptians do, I say, hold it. Where are you getting that from? When the Egyptians were alive, this is where my ancestors were. They were not in Egypt. So how can what the Egyptian eat 4,000 years ago have any impact on what my ancestors ate 4,000 years ago? You are not doing history well. If anything, if you really want to go back, you want to go back 100 million years to African cuisine only, as in, hey, we all came out of Africa going to Cornwall, so it's eating strictly African-oriented food, and that means a total change from Western diets or even Northern European diets. The question is it valid going back 100,000 years or not? I would say it's more likely if you go back 500 to 4,000 years or 500 to 1,000 years, you're probably going to hit a much better microbiome match. Okay. So that is it. That is basically giving me some explanation, and particularly trying to address people who go for inappropriate Paleolithic or Egyptian style diet or Mesopotamian style diet, or the quote older civilization diet. If your DNA comes from those parts, dead on. If your DNA comes from another part of the world, doesn't apply. Do your homework, take care, eat naturally healthy and avoid all the unnatural food that corporations are trying to push into your regular menu. That's it.